To Big Ideas by the Sea. My name is David Malone. I'm chairing this panel. The British landscape has never been, I don't think, more in focus as a place of natural beauty and a place of comfort. I think the lockdown has taught us that. And I think if you're anything like me, the lockdown made me realize that I've been taking it for granted. We take our own bodies for granted. How many of you get up in the morning and think to yourself deeply, "Ooh, I'm feeling healthy, I'm not in pain"? Because it's there all the time, you don't. It's only when you wake up one morning and your back is hurting, you notice your back. And I think nature has been, for too many of us, because it's there when you wake up, the sun shines on you, you don't think about it, the grass is under your feet, the trees are there. You don't think about any of those things until someone knocks them all down and puts a car park up in its place. And I think nature also is something that you can see as very passive. It's just like you see a poster. Oh, there's a picture of a beach or some trees. It's not until you actually get out into it that you're part of it physically, that you realize that nature actually can tell you something. It can tell you a story. Just moving from A to B, going on a walk through a walk in a path is already a story. It's if you're willing to listen to it, if you're not too preoccupied with, did I forget to switch the oven off, and am I going to pay the next mortgage? But if you can quieten all of those down, nature sometimes can actually, there's a story unfolding around you. So I thought I'd ask each of our panelists to tell us briefly what the stories are that nature has told them. And since Kane roped us all into this, we unanimously took a vote that we're going to make him go first.
I'm happy to do that.
Okay.
I think, Phil, if you've got a slide, I'd like to bring a slide up, really. And I think this is kind of key to this. For me, the main story really is access to landscape as a child. Running around the fields of Bury and North Manchester was really important for me. And I realise now that that kind of transformed everything for me as a young boy. But the story I really want to tell is the story of this painting, and I'll make it really quickly. Because as an 11-year-old boy, went to secondary modern school, comprehensive he was then, we were taken up to Lake District, and it was the first time I'd ever seen mountains. Mountains, lakes, rivers, fresh air, open air. And it actually absolutely transformed my life, because from that point onwards, I always wanted to go back. And I've been taking the kids back ever since. And a lot of you might know the Bowderstone in the Lake District in Borrowdale, where you walk up those steps and you get to the top. And I've been taking my kids up since they were that high and scaring the life out of Louise, my wife. But that particular painting of haystacks, where Wainwright his ashes are scattered up there, is really important for me as a location. And inspired me to make that painting. But the best part of that day when I painted that was, it was about 9:30 in the morning, and I heard a burp, and there was a chap standing behind me, slightly drunk, rocking from side to side. And I thought to myself, where have you come from? There was nobody anywhere around. And he said to me, would you like a glass of wine? I said, pardon? He said, would you like a glass of wine? I have 2 bottles just cooling in the lake. And I thought, where you come from? He said, well, I've just been camping the other side of the lake. And it occurred to me, he was enjoying the Lake District in a very different way. Slightly drunk, I have to say, but he was actually staying there. And he said the sunset and the sunrise was spectacular. And he hitchhiked up from Manchester. And I guess the way that I perhaps would have done, 20 years ago. And it made me realise that we all appreciate the landscapes in different ways, and we all take something from the landscape from different ways. So for me, is kind of a starting point. Thank you.
Sorry, I apologise, ladies and gentlemen. In my rush to get things started, I didn't introduce our speakers. So, Kane, for those of you who haven't met the force of nature, was worked for 35 years teaching in art schools, then retired 2017 to become a full-time landscape artist. And you got a lot of international attention for your what was it called again? Oh, the House
The
Project.
House Project,
The
yeah.
House
I bought a house on the edge of a cliff and turned it into a work of art, an art installation. It was an environmental piece of art as well, and invite artists to respond to that piece. And you know, I graffitied all over the house about the various crises that we have, crisis in education. And then it went kind of global, and then we had to get it knocked down. We had a demolition order put on the property, and that was quite an amazing experience, really. But that was inviting other people to respond to the landscape and to that space.
Thanks. So on my left is Anj Handa. She's the founder of Inspiring Women Changemakers, which is an inclusive community of changemakers with a focus on fairness and safety for women. And she's also been featured in Forbes magazine as one of the 10 diversity and inclusion, sorry, that's your handwriting, inclusion trailblazers, which you have to get familiar with. And then the bit I like best is she was also featured in iNews, and I quote, as a bloody brilliant woman. So, Anne, would you tell us what stories nature tells you when you're in it?
Sure. As a woman in her 40s, nature, for me, is accessing it without self-consciousness. You very rarely see someone who looks like me out on the hills, because you rarely see black and brown people out in landscapes. And growing up, we were members of the National Trust. My dad grew up at the foot of the Himalayas in Dehradun. He's always loved nature, so that early influence about accessing nature and the deep connection to it was part of my own influence. And then later in life, getting involved in doing the Yorkshire Three Peaks Challenge, climbing Ben Nevis, I love the peaks, and it becomes addictive. It was what you said, David, about not taking nature for granted. But that self-consciousness of people not exactly being hostile, but staring very curiously because they don't see people like you accessing nature in that way, is something that I've had to, gain a tough skin and become less self-conscious and try to encourage other people to access nature in that way. Not with great success, if I'm honest, and I don't know why. I conducted a survey about 2 years ago, and by conducting a survey, I meant I asked people on LinkedIn, there was only one British Asian man that actually did walk the peaks of England, Scotland and Wales, and everybody else that was black or brown accessed nature in a very urban setting. So I haven't got to the bottom of this yet. I'm not sure I ever will, but to me it's that overriding connection with nature that helps me get over that self-consciousness. I need it for my health. And I broke my ankle in 2017, not on the peaks. I'll hasten to add, it was on a mountain in Barcelona that I'd just descended. And so that put paid to my hiking on the hills for about 2 years. And it was really a shift in mindset that helped me get out to the Peak District and do my first 12-miler again. And I just felt so great for doing it. So for me, it is that deep connection to nature and what that means to me as a woman now.
Can I just ask you one thing? When you say it's a less self-conscious, do you mean that you sort of have to stop thinking I'm here and just, what do you mean?
No, about the stairs. I told you about the curiosity. Okay. So just when you go out, if you're walking around small villages around the UK, and particularly in York and North Yorkshire, and as I said, it's not hostile, it's just, you're such a novelty. Right. And so I have to not be self-conscious, because otherwise that will just prevent me from accessing nature in the way that I love to do.
Thank you. Dr. Andy Tickle, all the way over there. Hey, Andy. Is a former Greenpeace activist. I think I know you from those days, actually. Now campaigns at the CPRE, which is the countryside charity, principally working on landscape, energy and climate issues. He also chairs the British Mountaineering Council's advisory group on access, conservation and environmental sustainability. So, Andy, tell us the story that nature tells you when you're out in it.
Okay, thanks, David. My story is very similar to Kane's. I'm a city kid. I grew up in suburban Liverpool, and I came to love nature and landscape through family holidays in North Wales, being in the Scouts, quite a rough, tough, working class scout troop, and getting into climbing. So I'm also aware, partly sort of coming on to what Andrew's just been saying, that my background and my white sort of middle class privilege is also part of how I accessed the countryside. And I think how we make access more open to everyone is an issue which we might want to talk about today. Sadly, in some respects, now I see nature and landscape as a conflict zone. Certainly in my day job, I work with the planning system, and it's how we resolve the pressures in the countryside through planning. As David said, I started my career at Greenpeace in the late 80s when acid rain was the big environmental issue. And so in that sense, I was campaigning on the threat, the damage that acid rain was doing to our countryside. You know, it was spoiling my special places, and that made me angry, and that's why I wanted to work with them as an angry young man, as it were. If you spool forward, 30 years now, and I work for CPRE, which is not a particularly angry organisation, very much an insider organisation. What I'm predominantly doing day to day is how do we manage the solutions to climate and nature in the countryside? Because the countryside, of course, is a resource for many things. It's a resource for our amenity and enjoyment and our nurture in nature, but also there's quarries in the countryside, and the solutions in terms of renewable energy to the climate crisis are also there. So how we manage that, I think, is really important. And something in the last couple of years, I got involved in the fracking movement, or anti-fracking movement, and CPRE came to it quite late in the day. Others were leading first, Friends of the Earth, etc. And we got involved because it then, it started to become a planning application issue. And we were helping communities to get to use the planning system to their advantage and try and stop fracking. And I've never seen such a mobilization of concern, of people, such a broad mobilization about any issue in the last 20 years that I've worked on countryside stuff for CPRE, and it was just amazing. And what it showed me was how deeply people care about their local environment, about the countryside, how deeply they care about the climate emergency, the nature emergency. So, the question again for me today is about, how we mobilize that into what our future vision of landscape and countryside and nature is.
Thank you, Andy. Our speaker is Sarah Oswald. Morning, Sarah. She's a heritage professional and creative coach, and she sits on the North York Moors National Park Authority Board as a Secretary of State appointed member, who I think you've been appointed again, haven't you?
Yes.
And I think it's also fair to say it's something you're extremely passionate about, when I've heard you speak before. So tell us the stories that nature tells you.
Thanks, David. Yes, it's definitely something that has brought me closer to nature in the now 8 years since I've been a National Park Board member. And I think for me, the story that nature tells me is connection and connectivity. And that's been really obvious for me personally over the last year, when we couldn't connect with people. As you can tell, I'm not from Yorkshire, and my family are in Scotland. So this past year has been really something of being distant from people, obviously, and physically unconnected, but the opportunity to walk in the landscape around me with my dogs and actually see other people also walking and also hear the noises of nature around me. There was something amazingly sort of connecting about actually hearing the birds and hearing the sounds around me when you couldn't hear traffic and you couldn't hear planes and you didn't hear industry about you. And I think it's that connection and what that does for our well-being that is the real story for me of nature at the moment. And within the North York Moors National Park Authority, one of the things that I've become increasingly interested in is that health and well-being aspect of being in our environment. And things that have really brought that to fore for me are things like a study that we did in 2018 around the social return on investment of engaging with the protected landscape. And we only looked at two areas. We looked at volunteering, and we looked at the access that we provide for visitors through public rights of way and through engaging in that way. But it told us that for every £1 of DEFRA money that was invested, so the core funding that we have as a national park, there was at least £7 return in health and well-being benefits. We assessed later on the impacts of the Explorers Club, which is our club for families, and Young Rangers, which is the opportunities that we offer for young people. And that was a return of £6 for every £1 invested. And what it really told me was not just the numbers, because there's definitely an economic argument for caring for our environment and connecting with our environment, but it was also the feedback, the fact that families said they felt stronger relationships through working together and through their mental health, that young people felt more confident, they felt a greater sense of responsibility, they cared for the environment, and they actually wanted to do things in the environment. And you're talking about that care. And it is, the more we're connected, the more we're part of that environment, the more we care. And the more we care, the more likely we are to impact in a good way on our environment. And I think there's a phrase that always sticks with me that in my mantra meditation group that I go to on a Sunday, the leader always says, as part of our kind of session, if you heal the planet, we heal ourselves. Heal ourselves, we heal the planet. And for me, that feels like that is exactly where we are right now. It's that holistic approach to biodiversity, to the health and well-being of our planet, and to the health and well-being of ourselves. So that's really where nature, the story that it's telling me at the moment.
Can I just ask you, did you get any feedback from people telling you why they thought they felt happier or more connected with each other? 'Cause it's not necessary that it should be that way. But it is. So do you have some sense of why it affects people that way?
No, and I'm not sure people can articulate it. But it's not just the social return on investment study that we did that said that. There are other studies. DEFRA and University of Exeter did an evidence paper in 2017, and that also talked about greater social connection through engagement with nature and feeling connected. So there's something there. I think there's something in our evolutionary psychology behind that, because we seek out nature. That's part of where we've come from, where we've evolved from as humans, and that's also something to do with our social connection as well.
Does that speak to you, that?
Very much, because we're there ourselves, but when you have this expanse, so if you're on the moors as an example, you just feel part of something so huge. And that's the interconnection, and I agree with Sarah. I don't think people can articulate that, and it's experiential until you experience it. But may I pick up on something Andy was saying? Because how do we foster that sense of connection? So, for example, through Inspiring Women Changemakers, I coached the frack-free Rydale team. So fracking is something, even though I'm so far away in North Leeds from the site, and when it was all going on, I felt desperate about that. I just didn't want it to happen. And I was lucky that I was commissioned to get involved in supporting the team and helping to write a report. But and I don't have the answer for this, how do we make people a bit angry? Andy, when you said you were angry about acid rain, because it's very frustrating that we have this climate emergency and not enough people are seeing it as an emergency.
Yeah, I mean, I think actually it's quite easy to get people to be angry, and fracking made a lot of people very angry very easily because it was such a stupid idea. There's industrialising the countryside never sounds like a good idea, but sometimes it's necessary. There are minerals that, as the quarries industry always say, can only be found in one spot, and quite often that happens to be in the middle of a national park. So then you might need to dig those out. And that's what I call sometimes the necessary industrialisation of landscape or nature. But, you know, digging out fossil fuels at a time when we need to be stopping using them and starting a new 20 to 30 year industry just because some fairly high up people in the government, you know, thought it was a good idea to back it and to encourage the industry, you know, just grated with people. You know, they knew enough about climate, they knew enough about, they didn't know, they just loved the landscape and loved their locality generally. And they weren't, you know, fabulous landscapes that were being, you know, threatened. They weren't national parks. The developers aren't stupid. You know, the planning system does work to a degree. It pushes development away to the sort of least worst place. But even so, it was still next to people, and people didn't like that. But what I think is more difficult to sort of round the question up is how you get people on board with solutions that require change in the landscape. And I'm just about to start a project, or I've bid up to be the facilitator on a freelance basis, where we're going to go into 3 North Yorkshire communities and say, look, your landscape's going to change. You know, whether it's climate change that changes it, or whether it's the introduction of some climate mitigating solutions, which might be a solar farm, which might be a wind turbine, which might be more woodland to soak up carbon, etc. What are you comfortable with in terms of the degree of change in your landscape? And we're going to get people sitting together in village halls to firstly kind of understand the issue, and I'm sure they probably do already, but just kind of get us to a common basis, and then say, can you reimagine your valley or your parish as to what it would look like 20 or 30 years hence? And how can we agree on the degree of change that's acceptable to you? What does it mean economically to you? What does it mean in amenity terms? And how do we get there using the planning system? But it's about social license. And that's where people get angry, is when things get done to them, you know, without that social license.
Yeah, I was going to pick up on that. It's one thing if someone just tells you, this is the new story and we're just going to impose it on you. But if you, it seems to me what you're saying is if you give people the chance to be the author, or at least part of the author of the change that's going to happen to them, and feel that they're having a hand in writing not just their part in it, but the whole story, that somehow makes it gives them some ownership of the story, doesn't it?
Yeah, and there's also a deep-seated, you know, rural-urban divide as well that we just need to face up to. We don't need to overemphasize it necessarily, but we need to face up to it. And this is a thing about things being done to the countryside, or the rural communities, you know, which are on their arses, you know, in many, many ways. You know, the future of farming is difficult, you know, the future of a rural business is difficult, they haven't got the broadband, etc., etc. It's about a positive vision for the countryside, which they can buy into, and they see brings back profits to them. Not a huge wind farm on a hill, which is, you know, the perception is that the electricity goes into the grid and goes somewhere else. Well, actually it doesn't, it goes to their homes. It just, electrons flow to the nearest place where you press a switch. But the profits from that are definitely not really going back into the community. So it's about community energy and ownership.
Can I pick up on that? I think it's this interesting point about change, and there's no doubt that we are going to see a lot of change in our countryside in the next 5, 10, 20 years, and it's something we're grappling with in the National Park Authority. We're just developing our new management plan for the next 20 years, and how do we identify a vision for the national park that delivers all the things that are expected of us. You know, the pressures of green recovery, this economic-driven green recovery with expectation to deal with, you know, carbon capture. I can't even begin to say how many trees we're expected to plant in the next, you know, 5 years or so. Where are we going to put them all, and how is that going to change that landscape that we currently value, that we recognise for its particular qualities? And often those qualities in the moors are because they are moors and there aren't a lot of trees in a lot of places. What is that going to do? How is that going to change the way we see things? And it does make me, really pick up on that point that it needs to be about consultation and engagement, and where are people comfortable, and how are communities going to relate to that landscape now going forwards.
I just wanted to ask you something, Ange, if I may.
Yeah.
I just, by chance, I was just speaking a couple of days ago to someone who's an expert on rewilding and rewilding cities, and the point that he was making was a lovely Italian author, Stefano Mancuso, if you've come across him. He's written a really lovely little book, really beautiful book. And he said, by all means, let's plant trees in the countryside. But he said, what about the towns? There's hundreds of thousands of acres on the top of buildings. He says, why not plant things on them? Why not bring nature back into the places? And it'll make them nicer. And he said, he quoted figures at me. He said, if we just put greenery in all the places in our cities, it would, I forget the percentage, but it was an enormous percentage of change, of sucking the carbon back out of it. Would that work?
There's been a lot of debate recently in Leeds. Locally, I'm the wrong person to ask because I live in very leafy North Leeds, and I've just rewilded a whole strip of land that belongs to me behind my garden, which was an incredible project in lockdown, coming back to the bird song that Sarah talked about. But in high streets, I think whether it's in Leeds or any other city, there's talks in Stockton, I think now, about the high streets closing down, and that they're going to have to, as Andy said, reimagine these spaces to draw people back into towns as well, because the current model isn't working, and we have to start doing things differently. So that has to be in consultation with people. But I do think there is even a divide between central city locations and outer kind of leafy suburbs like mine, and then rural. So there's a bit of a hierarchy that goes on when it comes to being able to access nature in the first place.
Can I just bring you back in, Kane? Because we're sort of, some of the stories we've been talking about are still sort of stories that come from outside nature, the concerns of things like climate change, which are big things. I just wanted to get us back to the idea of when you're actually in it personally, because we've talked a lot about how you actually try to paint a painting where it draws you in, and there's a sort of a journey within the painting, the journey of the story that has struck you when you're making the painting. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, I can. But before I jump into that bit, I watched a documentary recently about a city in China where they were growing cabbages in the cracks of pavements, and I thought it was fantastic. It was just they were planting seeds in the cracks of pavements in the streets, and there were rows and rows of cabbages. And broccoli, and what a fantastic way to use the landscape. I have noticed the landscape, the colours of the landscape beginning to change. That is a fact, and that's reflected in my paintings as well. The North York Moors, that's beginning to change. Talking to the farmers up there, I remember 30, 40 years ago when we used to drive over when the kids were a little bright purple. That is changing, it's greener now. And for whatever reasons that might be, whether or not because of environmental issues or whether it's being managed, and talking to the gamekeepers, they said that's the case. So I think there's some concerns about that. But also a few years ago I was painting up Derwent water, and it was green blue algae. And part of the triathlon that week, the swimming part of the race was cancelled because it was dangerous. And it was attributed to climate change. So the colours are beginning to change. The whole mountains are beginning to change. The weather conditions are beginning to change. So in a sense, my paintings are a record of that change over the last 20 years. And if I continue to paint for the next 30 years, it'll probably be more radical. I was up there a few years ago, a few years ago when we had Storm Alice. That was my turning moment where I wasn't exactly strapping myself to the mast of a ship, but I was strapping myself to a tree, at Ruskin's Point, looking across Derwent water. And I was painting away as you do, but they were 4-foot waves. They were 4-foot waves, So I'm beginning to see now the landscape transform because of climate change and attributed to climate change, and it's definitely happening. And the colours are definitely changing. So my paintings have always been, I've never painted pretty pictures. They might look like that, but they've always been quite political. They're always meant to reflect the landscape and the colours of the landscape. and social history. I'm really interested in social history. I used to take students out into the landscape. So what are we looking at? Oh, blue skies, yeah, green landscape, yeah. No, what are we really looking at? You know, if you look at that dry stone wall, that cheesed off a lot of people a couple of hundred years ago because of the enclosures. One of my first, I remember as a student, one of the things that really struck me when I was reading John Clare, the peasant poet, when he wrote a poem about enclosures and the acts of enclosures, and he was being kind of quite worried and scared and felt threatened. So, but I'm definitely seeing that. I'm definitely seeing the colours change in the landscape, and that's reflected now in my paintings.
Yeah, I think the social aspect is very interesting, isn't it? Because there is a temptation, especially if you're coming from a town or a city, to walk out into nature and go, nature as it has always been.
Yeah.
And yet, nature's never the way it's always been. It is a sort of an overwriting of its own history and the history of all of the creatures, including us, who've changed it.
Yeah,
I mean, the moors is an example.
It's a palimpsest, isn't it? It's kind of the landscape's been rewritten and rewritten and rewritten. You know, and if you're an archaeologist, you can be able to dig through that. You can find out its history and its social past. And if you go to somewhere like Rosedale, where it's a beautiful landscape, you know, 100 odd years ago, it was a massive industrial landscape, and it was quite a vicious working environment. So I've done a series of paintings recently where I've been painting with limonites, which is, from iron ore. So I've been done a series of paintings, and so kind of touching the earth and feeling the earth, and all those materials make a real difference. So I get a sense of place now when I'm painting by using materials of the earth from the place.
Well, that's really fascinating. Thank you. I was going to say, for your job, Sarah, is that sort of getting people to see or to understand that the history of the place, rather than just there it is, as if it had always been. Is there something in that which is useful for drawing people in and getting them to?
Yeah, I think working in the heritage sector, our challenge is always what story do you tell to help people then find their stories, their meaning in the landscape, without being didactic. So it's not about giving them lots of information, it's about opening up that story, opening up that perspective to them, and doing it in the right place so that we don't impact on the landscape. And a lot of what I do is trying to find that right spot to put that right piece of interpretation. And whether that's a graphic panel or whether more increasingly it's about artwork in the landscape. It's not just about painting the landscape, but it's actually putting something in the landscape that then sparks people's reaction, sparks responses, helps them to make that connection, develop that sense of place. And I think fundamentally it comes down to drawing out the people stories, trying to help people connect with people. You know, how do you understand, like you're saying, the dry stone wall, and actually recognising the many different hands that have been part of building that wall. Quite recently, I did a trip up to Cawthorne Camp, which is just past Pickering. And it doesn't look like very much. It's a big field. There's lots of scrubby stuff. There's some lumps and bumps. You walk up the hill. But the thing that helps you understand why it was so important is when you get to the top and you stand on the lookout structure and you look out across the landscape. And then you go, yeah. So that makes sense. That's exactly why the Romans were here, because they had that view. They could see to the north of them everything that was coming. They could see, pre the trees that are now in the woodland there, they could see to the south of them. They could see to Malton, they could see what was coming from that direction. And then you just realise this was so significant. And then you start to think about, well, how many of them were here? And I was very fortunate to actually have several archaeologists and landscape people there on the visit as well. So I got the full picture, I got that story. And you start to see the extent of those camps and realise how many people from across the empire. And this picks up to Ange really, there were faces, there were brown faces, there were black faces at that camp thousands of years ago, because they came across from all parts of the Roman Empire. So let's not think that it wasn't a place, being out in the landscape wasn't a place for, diversity. It's always been diverse.
Yeah, it's funny you talk about that camp. I've always taken my children up there, and as soon being children, I get the sense, because they were only little, they were sort of 5, they could immediately see that there were Romans there, and they ran off, and before I knew it, there in my children's mind there were Roman sentries, and they had camps, and they were marching up and down. So there is something that comes alive, isn't there?
Isn't that the power of imagination, though? And we lose that as adults. Children have that, and I think children in the landscape can connect with that imagination. They see the things that we don't see. We lose that as we grow older, and part of my job is often trying to find a way to help people back into that.
Yes. For you, Ange, is it easy to for your imagination to lock into that, or do you feel somehow, as you were saying, that it's...
No, but I'm a very curious person, and it's that awe. I think awe of just being in those places. So Sarah talking about that camp made me think about being up on ancient theatre in Santorini, and again you could see the amphitheatre, the remains of the laundry room, the temple, all of that was visible. And what was fascinating there was a volcanic eruption, but the people escaped, and they probably escaped because they had that vast view. So that really connected with me. Thank you, Sarah.
Andy, is it? You talked about being angry as a young man, but was it just that, or was there something that more the positive aspect? Because it strikes me that you can make people angry about things, but angry is often not a very sustainable emotion. You need somehow to engage people in that more positive, imaginative way, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was angry in the sense that I couldn't believe we were being so stupid as to not think that if you put a lot of air pollution up a big chimney at a power station, it wouldn't land somewhere and cause some damage. And, you know, it was not only our hills and lakes and forests that were being affected, it was Scandinavia as well. And, you know, I'd like to think my anger moved into action and what I could do about it, because I actually did a PhD in the impacts of air pollution on British native plants. But I wasn't a very good scientist, so I thought actually I could better, and I didn't think necessarily science was the answer. Just knowing things would, you know, politicians aren't particularly rational beings, or politics isn't particularly rational, let's put it that way. So I thought you actually need to G up the system a bit, and that's kind of why I got involved. But I wanted to come back to this well-being area, which was where we kind of started, in relation to some of the things that Sarah was saying about the landscape change, because clearly you've got form and function in the landscape, and the form, as Kane was saying about the dry stone walls, tells us about the previous functions. But I think we need to be much less hung up about how it looks at the moment. Yes, there's incredible stories in there that we need to tell, and they're exciting and they make us curious and they learn, and it's part of our learning to love landscape. But if the pandemic's shown us anything, I think it's about that the space there is really, really important. National parks are incredible, and you know, they give us that health. We could have the social prescribing to go out and see them on a walk or whatever. Therefore, even if the landscape changes quite radically, and I'm from the edge of the Peak District, I live in Sheffield, and it becomes a much more closed landscape, if it still gives us that recreation, if it gives us a diverse nature, if it gives us climate solutions, it gives us places to breathe, does it matter if it's covered in trees again? I don't really think so, but unfortunately the conservation movement has always been on the back foot. It's always been struggling to protect, you know, by creating national parks, by creating national nature reserves. The whole story of the 20th century is back foot protectionism and some gains. And I think, especially conservation professionals, we're very, very kind of stuck on protecting what we've got, and we're very inimical to change. And so, you know, there's a landscape character assessment of the North York Moors, and if a planning application comes in, it's judged against it. And if there's too much change, everyone goes, whoa, we can't have that. So I think we need to start exploring relaxing on that, and also, again, listening to the community. what's their acceptable limit of change, not what the professionals in a landscape institute tell us.
Talking of, yeah, I think maybe what you just need in the landscape is a bit more excitement. And I think you're right, not to see nature as a museum. Something that is in a glass case, and you've got to walk around it and not tread on the grass. Those little signs, please keep off the grass. I always think, well, what else is grass for? I mean, don't tread on the grass. What do you want me to do? Put more concrete down so I can tread on that instead? It's ridiculous.
Well, I think, David, it's about getting people into the landscape. After this last lockdown, I was painting up in Northdale, and it was such a relief to get up there and paint. You could hear the cuckoo in the valley, you could feel the wind, it was raining, and I haven't been as happy as that for such a long time. So it is about getting people, and it's about managing that as well, particularly in the north. The parks is a real problem, I think. Managing people coming up because of millions, and particularly in the Lake District. I mean, it's not so bad where we live in North York Moors. I guess it's still a problem, but in the Lake Districts it's horrendous. But we still want people to go to the lakes, don't we? We still want to go there. I was saying about yourself. I discussed that many times with friends and walkers about we don't see enough people of colour up a mountaintop. But the other side of that, the flip side of that is that if you're a working class lad from Manchester, if you didn't have a Berghaus jacket on, you didn't feel comfortable. So it's about accessibility, and it's about if a working class lad from Manchester turned up with a baseball cap on and some plimsolls and he's walking up a mountain, he looks completely out of place. And why not? Those shoes probably cost more than the entire gear that the other person's wearing. So it's about accepting diversity in what we wear as well up a mountaintop, instead of going, oh, they've got a Berghaus jacket. They're acceptable. They can climb up here like everybody else. And I remember the Ruskin quote, and he said, well, we don't want the railways coming to Windermere because we'll get the drunks from Manchester coming. Yeah. And isn't it, but it is about how we open up the landscape to all communities, and we share that. And what we want is on the top of a mountain, a diverse range of people from backgrounds, and they're all doing the same thing. They're all going, wow, I can see Morecambe Bay, I can see right across the sea. I think I can see Ireland, wow, and that we're all sharing the same experience, and there's a commonality about that, which is really, really nice, and then you have a cup of tea, you get a flask. A chat to somebody, you have a conversation, and we're all the same. We're all enjoying the same experiences, but it can only happen on top of a mountain. Why can't we take that experience down a mountain and share it in the valley? So I think that's the things we should be looking at in the future, is how we take that and take it there.
It's a really interesting one, isn't it? Because I think this middle class, I think we're all middle class in this room, so to me it's more about social mobility, but also education about safety, because it depends on the peak. I remember when I went up Ben Nevis, they were taking someone down wrapped in the foil blanket, Yorkshire Ambulance Rescue were taking him down, and he had the hypothermia because it was absolutely freezing, and I'd been led up by a mountain leader, and we was part of a mountain group, so I knew how to keep safe, I knew what kit I needed, because conditions can change, and so I think if we're walking along the Trans-Pennine Way in Marsden, trainers are fine, right? But actually on a mountain we do need to be a bit safer, it's that education piece that the North York Moors and others can help together.
Well, I think that starts in schools as well. I mean, we used to take, when I was teaching in a college, we used to take kids out to the North York Moors, we used to take them up into the Wales. And I remember this particular group we took to North Wales, they were about 16, 17, and they were a really difficult bunch from a council estate in North Manchester. And I thought they didn't have a particularly good time, and I bumped into one of these students, or these kids, about 4 or 5 years later. Said, "Kane," he said, "I loved it that much. I stole a car and went back the following week." And that was probably about nearly 40 years ago. So I suspect that was a success. So I suspect that those kids now are probably taking their own children back to North Wales and having no similar experiences.
Hopefully in their own car.
But hopefully in their own cars.
I think that illustrates one of the big challenges. A lot of these landscapes, our protected landscapes, are difficult to access unless you have the resource of a car, for example. Or the ingenuity to steal one, obviously. But it's, how do we address our public transport infrastructure? Many years ago it was okay. Pre-beaching cuts, you could get to a lot of these places. Thank you industry in the North York Moors, there was actually railway lines that could get through, but they don't exist anymore. So, it needs an effort across all aspects to increase that accessibility of these special landscapes, and that's investment in infrastructure, investment and thinking about our education system. I really struggle to see how the Protected Landscape Report, the Glover Report's ambition for a night under the stars for every child. How are we going to make that happen when you have such a constrained curriculum? Teachers have limited time and capacity. And we know there's the demand, but how are we going to make that work within the constraints of everything? So I think there has to be a holistic approach to creating that mobility to allow people the access.
Well, I think so, because that say a working class lad from Manchester taken to the Lake District, it transformed my life. Yeah. And it got me involved in the landscape, and it made me think about the landscape, and it made me think about becoming an artist and then going to art school. And I wouldn't have done that if I hadn't had those kind of trips. So, forward-thinking teachers from a comprehensive school in 1973, going back many, many years now.
I think it's about going back and recreating what we had probably in the 60s, 70s, and maybe tailing into the 80s, which is local authorities have places where, schools can visit, whether they're just an outdoor place or whether they're an educational place. Yeah. But we've seen those all disappear. The one that Sheffield City Council used to own in the Peak District is now owned by some fairly rich people who run a brewery there and have a visitor attraction, but it's no longer there pretty much, for kids. Yeah. The Peak District National Parks Study Centre at Lucille Hall is now a youth hostel. Still does some courses, it's still obviously there for people to actually stay in, which is great. But I also sort of wanted to pose the question because we've been ruminating about diversity and access in the countryside. 50 years maybe? Jackie Burgess was doing work at UCL in the 80s on this. We had the Mosaic project, which was absolutely fantastic, and I've been on quite a few Mosaic trips out of Sheffield and introducing people to the countryside. And CPRE's response on the Glover report has been to find funds to take people from city areas out to the countryside. But I'm guessing that sense of kind of we're helping you to get out to the countryside and we're acting as a substitute for what maybe government should be doing more widely or society should be doing more widely, it doesn't seem to work. And it seemed to me that the Mosaic model, which was about introducing people from communities, and it was, BME communities, but actually I think it's possibly more of a class issue as well, because there's a lot of dispossessed people in Sheffield who again have no access to the countryside because it's not in their imagination and it's not in their financial resources to get out there. But that was about making community champions who would then work within their own communities to take things out. But again, it's kind of faltered, or hasn't it, Ange?
Sorry, the seagulls were drowning you out towards the end.
I was saying, has the kind of Mosaic style approach, has that faltered, or how do we learn from it and move forward?
I see, I do have one example, and that Sarah has one as well, because we had a chat earlier in the week where there's a refugee and asylum seeker group based in Bradford. One of my members has been a volunteer for 10 years, and they have a minibus, so they take asylum seekers and refugees out to Malham, to Bentham. They went to Halls the other week, and so it's entirely volunteer run, and it's helping people that wouldn't access the countryside otherwise, but anybody can hop in. And I like that, because that is the, again, fostering that interconnection and that integration for people. And Sarah, I know you have one as well that you've done with the Moors.
On the North York Moors, after the sort of immediate Mosaic funding finished, we continued to deliver this. So we continued to fund a part-time officer who's based in Middlesbrough in one of the hubs and who connects with communities there. And she works to find people who want to be community champions. We provide them with opportunities to them. We bring them into the park, we give them map reading skills, we show them how to access it. We work with the Esk Valley Railway around kind of transport provision. and we have a subsidised minibus, so they can actually ask to book minibuses that are subsidised to bring people from their communities in. And annually, we usually have a sort of big picnic where a whole range of community champions come in, and then we try to do it with communities in the moors. So we actually get that connection then. And so it doesn't seem so strange to see these different faces and to hear different voices and different languages in the park. And what I think is really interesting is they all talk about bonding over food. The thing when we talk to them, and the thing that they all remember a lot of the time is everybody brought different foods, and then they shared foods together from different communities, from different parts of the world in this wonderful landscape. And we know that the impact for the people who engage with the champions continues. And I have got, anecdotally stories of people who have accessed that, come into the moors, and then realised that actually they could cycle somewhere. So if they got a cheap bike, they could cycle to somewhere, then get into the moors themselves. So it does start to make people come back on their own or with groups in their communities. It's a drop in the ocean of what we can achieve, but it does make a difference.
I was going to say, coming back to North Manchester, or Manchester and many places around the country, in the Lake District particularly, the hostel that we stayed at was a place called Glaramara, which is at Borrowdale, and I completely forgot where that was. And for many, many years, I wanted to find out where it was, because it was such a transformative experience. And about 2 or 3 years ago, I went back in and I spotted it. And there's a frieze on the wall there. And it was like taking me back to being 13 again. And it really it was quite special. So I said to the receptionist, I said, I was here when I was 13 and it transformed my life. Did all this? She said, you're not the first to say that. Hundreds of children from North Manchester must have gone there and had their first experience of the mountains staying in this hostel. And all that seems to have changed. And it's a real worry that might continue in the future. That we don't, teachers particularly are worried about taking kids out into the environment. But hopefully that will change in the next few years.
We've only got a few more minutes left, so I just wanted to bring it back to something. And you talked about a sense of awe, and I think you also talked about it.
Yeah.
Because there's a sense in which we're thinking, what does this do for us, and how do we feel about it? But isn't there that sense of awe comes from something else, which is the sense that you're in something that's bigger than you are, much older than you are, doesn't really care about you, and would be quite happy if you weren't there. I mean, us, human beings in general. In other words, rather than always think, what does this do for me? Maybe we turn it around and say, well, look, there's a much bigger, older, much more important story. I mean, the health of the planet.
You feel it.
Doesn't depend on us.
Yeah.
The health of the planet basically depends on green things.
Yeah.
And green things have been here a lot longer than us. And their story, the story of green things, is just different from the Johnny-come-latelys that run around on two legs thinking how important they are.
Yeah.
Is that sense of stepping back and thinking there's a much older, much more important story here. The stuff out there is what keeps you alive.
Yeah.
Humans, animals, do nothing
to
keep the planet alive, precisely nothing. It's the green things. Without green things, everything stops. Yeah. We red-blooded things contribute absolutely nothing to the health of the planet. Yeah. I mean, 400 million years went by, well, actually, 2 billion years went by before there were any animals. Yeah. So there's an older story, surely, which part of that is what strikes you when you're in it. Is that, true?
I feel it. I feel it when I'm up a mountain or I'm in a valley and the weather closes in, you feel it. But of course, my job as a painter is to try and make sense of all of that as well. So sometimes you're fighting with it. You're trying to kind of give it some sort of shape and form, because mountains don't come perfectly, structured in a great compositional way. So you've got to kind of make sense of it. So sometimes you're fighting with it, and that storm's coming. So if you're painting watercolour like I do, big paintings, you've got to work really quick. So while you're sitting there and standing there enjoying it, you've got to think, crikey, I've got to kind of transform this experience into a work of art. So you're sometimes fighting against the elements, which is all part of the fun of being a painter, I have to say.
Do you have a feeling, that sense of this bigger, older story, is that in any way important to you?
It's hugely important, but it's also the big and the very tiny, because microorganisms were here when we weren't here and animals weren't here, and so that kneeling down as well, that also contributes to all. So I think for me it's remembering that it was here, and even in a different form, it will always be here, but we're custodians right now, so what do we do to support this planet?
Does it speak to either of you two, that older story?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I absolutely agree with what you said. We're giving nothing back. It's just whether at the last minute we realise our future depends on changing things very radically. And I was also struck, there's a book by Richard Mabey from the early 2000s, just been reissued, called Nature Cure. And I think he was reading it on Radio 4 the other week. And there was an article about it a while ago, and he was basically saying, well, everyone's going on about, you know, bloody nature and everyone enjoying nature bathing and nature cure, nature balm, etc. But it's nature in the form of the coronavirus that's come back and bit us on the arse, you know, and it's going to be that kind of prompt that gets us to sort things out, hopefully.
Sarah?
Yeah, I think it does come back to this, you know, we've talked about getting angry and we've talked about caring, and it comes back to us being able to connect with our emotions when we're in those spaces. So it's not just about knowing about the details of where we are, knowing about its history, knowing about the nature. It's being able to recognise those feelings, and then from those feelings take action in some way and spur us on to what we want to do. And even if that's one tiny little individual action that's picking up the litter when we're walking the landscape, or it's taking those big actions collectively, that's what's going to make the difference to healing us and the planet together, I think.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think we're just about out of time. So could I just ask you to join me in thanking our panelists?